The Swimmer. In 1968, a strange, quietly released film called The Swimmer hit theaters and just as quickly vanished. Burt Lancaster stars as a man who tries to swim home through the backyard pools of his affluent suburban neighbors. What begins as a fanciful notion soon descends into a surreal, disquieting odyssey through loss, denial, and the gradual erosion of the American dream. Adapted from a short story by John Cheever, who would win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1979, the film defied the usual expectations of a mainstream release. Its fractured narrative, unnerving tone, and spare score bewildered critics and viewers. Vincent Canby of the New York Times reportedly deemed it grim and disturbing, far from a glowing endorsement in the late 60s. Behind the lens turmoil mirrored the film's jagged storyline. Director Frank Perry was ousted mid-production after clashing with producers, and a then up-and-coming Sidney Pollack stepped in to wrap the shoot. The outcome? A patchwork mood that still fuels debate among film historians. Certain scenes were reshot, others scrapped, and whispers linger that Perry never absolved the studio for marginalizing him. Lancaster, for his part, underwent rigorous training. He wasn't a natural swimmer when hired. His dedication paid dividends. His emotionally stripped portrayal remains one of the most haunting of his career. Ticket sales were bleak. Yet decades later, The Swimmer discovered renewed vigor as an underground favorite. Starting in the early 2000s, reviewers began to reinterpret it as a daring psychological study way ahead of its time. Its imprint can be detected in subsequent films such as American Beauty and Donnie Darko, both of which examine the corrosion beneath picturesque suburbia. Some film enthusiasts even posit that The Swimmer subtly critiques post-war masculinity and capitalist disenchantment, though opinions vary. Presently, it's available on platforms like the Criterion Channel, where it's finally being lauded as a long-lost treasure that still resonates with today's viewers. Petulia. Released in 1968, Petulia didn't merely anticipate its era, it practically leapt ahead by 10 years. Directed by Richard Lester, who had already jolted cinema with A Hard Day's Night and How I Won the War, this film emerged during one of the most unrestful periods in American history. Just months after the Tet Offensive and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Petulia arrived with a non-linear approach that seemed to echo the cultural turmoil outside the theater. Lester reportedly devised the jumbled timeline to visually reflect emotional isolation, forsaking conventional storytelling in a move that perplexed many reviewers. Julie Christie gave a performance that teetered between raw vulnerability and bold defiance, portraying a woman grappling with the paradoxes of modern identity. Pauline Kael likened it to a contemporary horror piece, while other critics dismissed it as overly stylized. Yet over time, its reputation blossomed. Steven Soderbergh and other filmmakers have cited Petulia as a seminal influence, chiefly for its disjointed narration and visual flair. Filmed on location in San Francisco, it distilled the city's late 60s energy. Shots at the Fillmore and Golden Gate Park now function like unintentional documentaries. Composer John Barry, better known for his James Bond scores, provided a composition that was odd and haunting, rather than heroic, highlighting the emotional disintegration beneath the film's glossy veneer. Some observers suggest Petulia's lukewarm reception was due to audiences' uncertainty about whether it was a romance, a satire, or something much darker. Either way, it's a long-ignored classic that feels more like a forerunner to 70s cinema than a product of its own decade. The Pumpkin Eater. Debuting in 1964, The Pumpkin Eater arrived with a subdued force that drew critics in and made many viewers shy away. Directed by Jack Clayton and scripted by Harold Pinter from Penelope Mortimer's partly autobiographical novel, the film was an unvarnished drama that fearlessly dissected the toll of domestic existence. Anne Bancroft, 2 years after her Oscar win for The Miracle Worker, turned in a performance so emotionally intricate that it earned her Best Actress at the Cannes Film Festival. She portrayed Jo Armitage, a woman buried by multiple pregnancies and a husband, played by Peter Finch, whose loyalty was more rhetorical than actual. Reviewers lauded the film's stark candor, but American ticketgoers hardly queued up. Its frank depiction of female frustration and dissatisfaction with conventional gender norms likely struck too close to home. Though it did open in the United States, it fared poorly at the box office, surpassed by more easily digestible offerings. Shot in sharp black and white by Oswald Morris, the visuals reflected Joe's internal desolation with almost surgical accuracy. Pinter's dialogue was riddled with pauses and veiled meanings, creating an emotional interference that continues to resonate. Some critics and historians suspect the film's meager financial performance arose from its unwillingness to dispense neat solutions, a rarity in mid-century movie making. There is even talk that studio executives, uneasy about its bleak outlook, considered scaling back its marketing. Now, The Pumpkin Eater endures as a piercing examination of mental strain and societal roles, an overlooked gem that will remain surprisingly current in its psychological depth. The Train. Unveiled in 1964, The Train addressed an issue that continues to stoke debate today. Is safeguarding cultural treasures worth endangering human lives? Directed by John Frankenheimer and set in the closing days of Nazi-ruled France, the narrative follows a freight train crammed with stolen French masterpieces speeding toward Germany. What unfolds is a gritty contest of cunning and fortitude between the occupiers and the French resistance. While most war films of the period opted for spectacle, The Train did the opposite, delivering unvarnished realism and unrelenting momentum. Burt Lancaster, cast as Railway Inspector Paul Labiche, reputedly insisted on doing many of his stunts, jumping between moving train cars and actually operating locomotives. Some historians claim he suffered a grievous knee injury partway through filming and returned soon after an operation, though records remain unclear. Shot exclusively in black and white, the film embraced a bare-bones, almost documentary aesthetic. Many suggest Frankenheimer chose this style to amplify the tension and validity, steering clear of the polished gloss seen in contemporaries like The Longest Day. Inspired broadly by real attempts to shield stolen art during wartime, the story poses a deeper moral quandary. What truly defines a civilization? Though it received solid reviews, the picture didn't attract widespread attention and eventually slipped from public consciousness. More recently, however, critics have reevaluated it as a distinctive fusion of action, intellect, and ethical gravity. Its reliance on genuine trains, practical effects, and minimal dialogue lends it a fresh bite that still resonates now. Point Blank. Point Blank arrived in theaters in 1967 and instantly puzzled mainstream viewers. At a moment when Hollywood was still churning out slick studio thrillers, this film burst in like a cinematic curveball. Directed by John Boorman and starring Lee Marvin, it stripped the gangster formula to its raw essentials. Marvin portrays Walker, a man double-crossed and left for dead, who reappears not in a rage but with a cool, methodical will. His dialogue is sparse. Some say Marvin himself requested line cuts, convinced that silence would be more impactful. Whether accurate or not, the outcome is a performance that comes across as more of a powerhouse than a traditional character. Shot across stark Los Angeles backdrops, from the geometric spread of LAX to minimalist mid-century interiors, the picture casts the city in a hollow light. Cinematographer Philip H. Lathrop's crisp, detached style mirrors the film's attitude, while Boorman's fragmented editing, leaps in time, flashbacks, and a patchwork chronology was unlike anything most American audiences had seen. Some film scholars propose that Point Blank bridged the gap between established noir and the experimental vigor of the European New Wave. Directors like Steven Soderbergh and Quentin Tarantino identify it as a major inspiration. Speculation persists that Christopher Nolan drew on its structural elements when designing the broken timelines in his early efforts. Despite its trailblazing flair, the movie performed poorly at the box office. Too cold, too peculiar, too soon. Over the years, though, it assembled a cult following. Critics now regard it as a pivot point in American film, one daring enough to reject the conventional hero's journey. And some conjecture that the film's cryptic resolution, with Walker melting into darkness, was Boorman's subtle refusal to provide tidy conclusions. In a world fixated on closure, Point Blank keeps the exit wide open, and perhaps that's why it still feels subversive. The Bedford Incident. Arriving in 1965, the Bedford Incident rode the crest of Cold War dread into theaters, and then swiftly vanished behind costlier war blockbusters. Directed by James B. Harris, once a partner of Stanley Kubrick, it features Richard Widmark as an inflexible American Navy commander and Sidney Poitier as a doubtful journalist enmeshed in a precarious maritime standoff. Based on a destroyer trailing a Soviet sub, the narrative reflects genuine anxieties from the early 1960s, especially the Cuban Missile Crisis. Filmed in stark monochrome, the picture intensifies the psychological strain of naval leadership. with commentators frequently likening its ethical anxiety to that of Fail-Safe, which appeared roughly 1 year earlier. The climax lands like a hammer blow, a dire launch set off by a trivial miscommunication. Hearsay indicates Widmark, who also produced, advocated for this grim resolution, reputedly insisting that any softer conclusion would undermine the film's cautionary stance on nuclear brinkmanship. Although it never reached the popularity of The Longest Day, present-day audiences have embraced the Bedford Incident as a harrowing, tightly crafted suspense piece whose caution about escalation remains unnervingly pertinent. The Pawnbroker. In 1964, Sidney Lumet took a substantial gamble with The Pawnbroker, a production many American studios were reluctant to support because of its stark depiction of Holocaust trauma. In an era when popular cinema largely bypassed such unvarnished content, this drama centered on Sol Nazerman, a Jewish pawnbroker in Harlem, portrayed by Rod Steiger in a performance that earned him an Academy Award nomination. Plagued by visions of the camps, Nazerman's emotional detachment is reflected in Lumet's use of disjointed editing and abrupt flashbacks, stylistic choices that eerily anticipated contemporary cinematic explorations of post-traumatic stress. Film scholar Annette Insdorf observed that The Pawnbroker signified a critical shift, transforming Holocaust representation from historical record to intimate ongoing torment. Yet it wasn't just the subject matter that triggered controversy. The picture sparked a nationwide censorship dispute over a fleeting nude scene. Despite objections from the Motion Picture Association of America, the sequence remained, making The Pawnbroker the first movie featuring nudity to earn the production code seal. That move nudged open the gate for a more liberated phase in American filmmaking. Soon came the score, Quincy Jones's initial foray into Hollywood, a bracing, jazz-tinged soundtrack that heightened the film's disturbing potency. Reviewers applauded it, though audiences were unprepared. The box office results were modest, dwarfed by its somber theme. Nonetheless, its influence has continued to expand. Currently preserved in the National Film Registry, it's frequently referenced as a template for future psychological dramas. Some observers even theorize that its profound emotional weight helped pave the path for portrayals like Liam Neeson's in Schindler's List. Grim, unyielding, and far ahead of its era, The Pawnbroker stands as one of the boldest, yet most underappreciated works of the 1960s. The Naked Prey. Unveiled in 1965, The Naked Prey veered sharply from typical Hollywood formulas. Helmed by and featuring Cornel Wilde, the movie abandoned extensive dialogue in favor of unfiltered physicality and visually driven narration. Its plot tracks a safari guide in colonial-era Africa, who finds himself pursued after his group's cultural incivility triggers violent retribution. Inspired by American frontier legend John Coulter, Wilde shifted the story to Africa, filming entirely in present-day Zimbabwe and South Africa, foregoing studio backlots for authentic landscapes and engaging local non-actors. The outcome? A lean survival saga that felt nearer to ethnographic film than a classic adventure flick. Commentators of that era were split. Some commended its restraint and avoidance of overt moralizing, while others criticized its silent passages as potentially masking a colonialist perspective. Whispers have lingered that Wilde clashed with backers over the feature's austerity, insisting on an almost mute script to amplify its primal atmosphere. Though it earned moderate box office receipts, it was quickly eclipsed by grand spectacles like Zulu and Lawrence of Arabia. Nevertheless, its stark minimalism and vivid truthfulness have stood the test of time. Contemporary viewers often draw parallels to The Revenant for its hostile terrain and unyielding pace. For a work that barely speaks, The Naked Prey continues to spark thoughtful debate. The Shooting. Monty Hellman's The Shooting, unveiled in 1966, is a spare western that scarcely made any waves initially, but is now heralded as a cult essential. Filmed over 18 days on a modest budget in the Utah desert, the picture abandoned well-worn tropes in favor of something far more enigmatic. Jack Nicholson, not yet widely known, co-produced and featured as a nearly wordless gunman whose mere presence outweighs his limited dialogue. The screenplay, crafted by Carol Eastman under the pseudonym Adrian Joyce, defied customary conventions, lacking a definitive protagonist, a tidy finale, or even much of a narrative thread. Several commentators back then were confounded, while others rejected it outright. Yet years on, film enthusiasts identified it as an archetype for the revisionist Western. Historian Jonathan Rosenbaum once noted it seemed like a Western created by someone who had never encountered one, and that was a compliment. Myths whisper that its otherworldly atmosphere and ethical haze silently influenced subsequent anti-Westerns, such as Dead Man and No Country for Old Men. Regardless of whether those directors consciously borrowed from Hellman, the imprint of the shooting reverberates through contemporary cinema. Its stark approach, metaphysical undercurrent, and refusal to clarify itself appear uncommonly forward-looking, perhaps too advanced for that era, but perfectly suited for audiences today. The Servant. Unveiled in 1963, The Servant methodically unraveled the traditional British class narrative from within. Directed by American exile Joseph Losey and penned by Harold Pinter, years before his Nobel Prize, this movie bypassed the era's polished formulas, opting for a chillier, more disquieting tone. Its center is Barrett, portrayed by Dirk Bogarde, a valet who gradually exerts psychological domination over his affluent employer, Tony, played by James Fox. What starts as an ordinary hierarchy morphs into a deeply unsettling reversal, with Barrett subtly pulling the levers from behind the curtain. The tension smolders beneath the veneer. No blasts, only hush, insinuation, and a methodical disintegration of self. Pinter's famously minimal language imbues every silence with menace. Cinematographer Douglas Slocum employed mirrors, off-kilter angles, and heavily shadowed compositions to reflect the characters' fractured psyches. The editing, oblique and confounding, resembled European art film more than anything the British public was accustomed to then. Losey, ostracized in Hollywood under McCarthyism, infused an outsider's rigor into Britain's stiff class hierarchy. Unsurprisingly, controversy trailed close behind. The Servant's homoerotic nuances, never explicit but impossible to overlook, caused unease among monitors and commentators. Some deemed it obscene, others hailed it as daring. Rumor has it certain sequences were trimmed for global markets, though firm documentation remains elusive. Despite positive notices, the feature was overshadowed by showier, more opulent successes like Tom Jones and Lawrence of Arabia, yet its legacy quietly persisted. A 4K restoration by the Criterion Collection in 2020 reintroduced it to contemporary audiences, and while direct homages are infrequent, directors like Bong Joon-ho and Park Chan-wook are frequently linked to its influence in their own class-focused thrillers. 6 decades on, The Servant still strikes a nerve. Its preoccupations, authority, reliance, identity retain their relevance. And its wintry mood, still potent enough to make the walls feel as though they're caving in. Seconds. In 1966, John Frankenheimer unveiled a film that baffled studios and stumped audiences even further. Seconds was no heartwarming blockbuster. It was a chilling sci-fi exploration that tore into identity, conformity, and the false promise of reinvention. The plot trails a disillusioned banker who stages his own demise through a clandestine operation and re-emerges with a new face, a new existence, and intensifying remorse. Rock Hudson, up to then celebrated for romantic roles, shocked critics by stepping into this part. The casting alone caused a stir. Some insiders supposedly cautioned it might derail his career. James Wong Howe, a 2-time Academy Award winner, brought an audacious, inventive approach to the cinematography. While accounts differ, the film's skewed framing and jarring close-ups generate a pervasive aura of dread. Some accounts claim Frankenheimer and Howe employed body-mounted camera rigs to amplify the claustrophobia, an early forerunner to methods now commonplace in horror and thrillers. Although it vied for the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival that same year, Seconds floundered in American theaters. Its grim perspective and anti-establishment underpinnings likely clashed with the more upbeat pop culture of the mid-60s. Many speculate Paramount, uncertain how to promote it, quietly held it back. Frankenheimer later labeled it one of his most misconstrued works. Over the years, the film's standing has evolved. Contemporary reviewers have drawn parallels between Seconds and modern psychological thrillers, pointing to its impact on everything from body horror to speculative narrative. The Criterion Collection's 2013 restoration enhanced its underground following. Today, Seconds stands as a neglected masterpiece of the 60s, hauntingly relevant, visually striking, and still potent enough to unsettle contemporary audiences. The Hill. Released in 1965, The Hill remains a grim anomaly in the war film category. Helmed by Sidney Lumet and led by Sean Connery, It replaced battlefield heroism with psychological torment inside a British military prison in the North African desert. The storyline zeroes in on soldiers penalized for trivial violations, subjected to punishing hikes up a man-made mound, a disciplinary measure that quickly devolves into institutional brutality. Connery, fresh off Goldfinger and soon to feature in Thunderball, took on the role of Trooper Joe Roberts to break away from his Bond image. The risk paid off. His performance shed all charm, leaving only raw confrontation. Lumet shot on the sun-scorched terrain of Almeria, Spain, where the ensemble reportedly endured the same brutal heat as their characters, conditions that tested both tempers and portrayals. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times commended the film's ferocity and its relentless critique of military power. Nevertheless, American audiences showed lukewarm interest, favoring more classic war sagas. Some speculate that Connery's heavy dramatic pivot baffled those expecting a suave spy. Over the long haul, The Hill has garnered praise as one of the era's most hard-hitting dramas, still gripping for its inquiries into authority, rebellion, and moral decay. Rumor even has it that Connery counted it among his career highlights in spite of its muted financial returns. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.